Happy Juneteenth. I'm recording this on Juneteenth, June the 19th, a federal holiday. Didn't used to be. For a long time, it was largely celebrated by Black American communities in Texas and Louisiana, in places where those communities migrated to during the 20th century, during the first and second Great Migrations. But in recent years, it's become more of a national Black American celebration than, of course, a federal holiday following the 2020 George Floyd protests. One of the symbolic things that came out of that, right? Everyone gets a day off. What's the significance of Juneteenth? I'm sure you already know this, but basically it marks the time when the last group of Black Americans in Texas and Louisiana learned of emancipation in 1865 after the end of the war. The last crop of people who were freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. And so it's considered, for the most part, to be a general celebration of emancipation, of this momentous moment in American history where the enslaved population, 4 million strong, are freed of bondage. I don't think Americans often appreciate enough just how momentous emancipation was. Again, I mentioned 4 million Americans. That was more than 10% of the total population of the country. They sustained the economy of one of the sections of the country, the South, because of the ways the economy of the South was intertwined with the Northern economy and economies across the Atlantic in Britain and France. They really sustained tens of millions of people's livelihoods. The destruction of chattel slavery then was this momentous world historical event. And what was all the more momentous and world historical is that these people were then integrated into the society. They weren't shunted aside as a subordinate caste. They were, nominally at least, citizens. And with the Reconstruction Amendment, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, they were citizens with the full protection of the Constitution. And in the years that followed, many of them would engage in the work of citizenship. They would run for office, serve in all kinds of public positions. And although there would be retrenchment, it's very important not to diminish the real significance of what happened. The significance of the 13th Amendment, the Constitution's first mention of slavery, which then abolished hereditary enslavement from the constitutional order. And if you like, we can have a separate discussion of the 13th Amendment and you could say, disagreements with the perspective that the 13th Amendment is responsible for mass incarceration. I think that's kind of bad history, but that's not the topic of this video. The topic of this video is actually the Emancipation Proclamation and why I'm not sure that Americans take it seriously enough as a founding document. Now, the Emancipation is kind of a strange document. As I'm sure most of you know, it doesn't free all enslaved people in the United States. It freed only those in those states that were rebelling, which meant that in border states, as they were called, like Kentucky and Maryland and Missouri, it did not free the enslaved. And yet, in the moment when it was issued, it was considered to be an epochal event. When it was issued, even critics of Lincoln did not see it as some kind of half measure. This is what they wanted. What they wanted was for the war to become an abolition war. What they had pressed for again and again and again was for the war to become an abolition war. When Black leaders like Frederick Douglass went to the White House, what they were telling Lincoln was, you have to make this an abolition war. And with the Emancipation Proclamation, he made this an abolition war. And we know from contemporaneous reports, from firsthand accounts, that those enslaved people who heard of the emancipation did not say, oh, well, it only frees some of us. They took it as this world-ending event, because it was world-ending in the sense that it was ending one particular world and birthing a new one. Its legal force may have been lacking. There remains this real question of whether it actually fell under Lincoln's war powers at all. But its symbolic force is hard to argue with. It's hard to deny the symbolic power of the Emancipation Proclamation, that for all of its staid language in most of the document, its central claim that you are henceforth and forever free is ultimately what mattered, is ultimately what made it significant. And it's this element of the Emancipation Proclamation, its symbolic power, the power of these particular words, henceforth and forever free, that should call to mind one of the other great documents of American history, that is the Declaration of Independence. We're a couple weeks away from Independence Day, but if you read the Declaration, you'll quickly notice that most of it is just a laundry list of grievances against the Crown, and they're not even particularly eloquent. We don't necessarily remember the Declaration for that laundry list of grievances. We remember it for its opening lines. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those are the words we remember. Those are the words that count. The rest of it is trivia for nerds. In addition to this stirring declaration of universal human rights, the other thing we take away from the Declaration, first and foremost, is that this is a country where there are no kings, where there are no monarchs, where we are free people who choose our own leaders. And I think one way to think of the Emancipation Proclamation, to think of its significance to American history, think of its significance to our identity as Americans, is to look at it as the next evolution of the Declaration of Independence. If the Declaration of Independence tells us that there are no kings, then the Emancipation Proclamation tells us that there are no masters, or rather, there are no slaves, and therefore, there are no masters. Funny enough, that's a bit of a paraphrase of Lincoln, who, when asked to define democracy, said that, as I will not be a slave, therefore I will not be a master. No kings, no slaves, no masters. If there's one thing to take away from this Juneteenth, it's that as Americans, we are not meant to be subordinate to others, that we're free people, standing tall, equal to each other.